So I will actually, since I'm in Maine, I will start my story in Maine. Which my longer story, of course, starts in Plymouth, New Hampshire, where I was born. But I'll start in Maine because it's where we are. I started college in 1999 at the University of Maine at Farmington, which, if any of you know UMF, it's a wonderful little school, kind of tucked away. It's really, really great time. I did a full freshman year, and then I went for my sophomore year, and after fall semester, I decided I'm going to take spring semester off and teach skiing. Because I grew up skiing in Plymouth, which, like Farmington, is a small college town with a state school in it. Plymouth and Farmington are two of the most similar communities possible, and the idea that I left Plymouth to go to Farmington means I really wanted to stay in Plymouth all along, but I'm so grateful for the years I spent in Farmington. That second semester, I took second semester off. I went home to Plymouth, and I taught at a little ski area called Tenny Mountain. And at this point, I was a pretty typical sophomore in college. I was 19 and reckless and disengaged politically. I was raised Unitarian Universalist, and I had a basic idea that killing people was wrong, and you should respect the inherent worth and dignity of everyone. And that was definitely part of who I was, but I hadn't necessarily put it into practice as in a way where I felt like my life needed a purpose that revolved around that principle. A little bit aimless, maybe. And so I taught skiing, and there was a guy named Craig who taught at that mountain. And wherever Craig is, he's part of a story that I have told to crowds all over the country, and he has no idea. But Craig had done 6 years in the New Hampshire Army National Guard in Charlie Company, 3rd of the 172nd Mountain Infantry. And I think Bravo Company is here in Maine of that same infantry company. And what we do is we specialize in mountain warfare. What we did, I'm not in anymore, obviously, which means hiking, ice climbing, rock climbing, rappelling, snowshoeing, skiing. These were things that really appealed to me. And he would tell me stories about going out 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year and hanging out with a bunch of guys and shooting guns and hiking and ice climbing and rock climbing and snowshoeing and skiing and rappelling. And I'd seen these ads that said the National Guard could pay for school. And mind you, it's 1999. At this point, it was the winter of, I guess that was the winter of 2000, 2001, because it was second semester of my sophomore year. Actually, I know it was the winter of 2000, 2001, because something relevant happened that next year. So when the snow melted, turns out the people stopped coming and asking for ski lessons once the snow melts, which was something I hadn't really planned for. And so I needed something to do with myself. So I walked into a recruiter's office and I said, "Hey, I've heard about this company that hikes and ice climbs and rock climbs and skis and snowshoes 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, and can I really get college paid for that?" And the recruiter said, "Oh boy, can you!" And I was in. I shipped to Fort Benning, Georgia Infantry School at the beginning of June 2001. And I remember a distinct sense that first day when they started us marching and they were teaching us a cadence, and it was, I'm going to call 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're going to shout "kill" at the top of your lungs. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, that doesn't feel quite right to me. Why would I want to kill? I want to hike and ice climb and rock climb and ski and snowshoe. When do I get to that part? And for the next 10 or 11 weeks, I went through infantry basic course. I was a split option, so I went back and did infantry school the next summer. But that first summer, I did Army Infantry Basic. And that 11 weeks, they they did what they do to soldiers who go through that. And if you want further reading on what basic training is, because I think very few people understand what basic training is and what it's designed to do. I mean, we have this vague concept: you get torn down and then built back up, right? And I don't think a lot of people really understand what that means, what happens to you. Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman was the psychological officer who designed the program I went through. And he has a short essay and a longer book that are entitled On Killing, that explain how that program works. And I'll give you a basic rundown of what Grossman describes. In World War II, they found that when SLA Marshall began researching soldiers and how they performed in combat, he found that less than 25% of soldiers were able to look at another human being down the barrel of the rifle and pull the trigger and kill that other human being, even when their life was in danger. He found that there was no correlation between valor, the ability to stand up and fire and go rescue your buddy. There's no correlation between that and who could kill and who couldn't kill. And so they started to research what was going on there. And it turns out that most vertebrates, there are a handful of exceptions, rats, a few other species that will kill their own kind. Most vertebrates will not kill their own species. It's something that we are programmed not to do. It turns out that humans are no exception. It's very, very hard to get a human to kill another human. Even a complete stranger, even somebody who's putting your life in danger, most humans will not kill. And as the job of the military is to engage in warfare, they wanted to make sure they found a way to train that out of folks. So they began to research how to do it. And so what they do is they physically exhaust you, limited sleep. They emotionally brutalize you, screaming at you, continued punishment regardless of performance. There is a cycle of basically you're trying to shut down the outer brain of a person, get their midbrain working only, so that they are operating on instinct. At that point, the brain really can't distinguish between reality and what's being presented. And then they pop up, at the end of this period, they pop up human-shaped targets in front of you. And you shoot down those human-shaped targets. And once you shoot down the proper amount, you're congratulated. You're given a full night's sleep. You're given a big meal, steak and eggs, pizza party. I was never really all that into music, but boy, oh boy, that first time that we passed basic rifle marksmanship and we got to listen to the radio for an hour, holy smokes, I loved music. Because I hadn't heard anything but cadence for a few weeks at that point. And then basically there are 1 week cycles. Over and over again, you're put through this cycle. You're brutalized, you're sleep deprived, your food is limited, you're put under extreme stress. Then you're put on a firing line, and human-shaped pop-up targets come up, and you shoot them down. And when you shoot down the requisite number, you're taken off the firing line and allowed to rest and given a reward. And they've continued to research how to do this better and better. By Vietnam, by Korea, well over 50% of people were able to shoot enemy soldiers. By Vietnam, it was over 85%. By Desert Storm, it was over 90%. And they now believe that anyone who goes through a combat arms basic training and MOS training course is fully conditioned and is capable of killing. And part of that is reflexive fire training, that you do it before your brain can process what you're doing. And part of that is that inner resistance to killing your own species is broken down. That was not learning to hike and ice climb and rock climb and ski and snowshoe. Long way around. So I came home as a National Guardsman, and I went back and I did a semester of school. But a couple weeks into that first semester, back at UMaine Farmington at that point, I graduated basic training on August 23rd, 2001. So I'd been home a little over 2 weeks when 9/11 happened. And I realized when I joined the National Guard, my thought was, well, the National Guard helps with flooding, ice storms. Like, this is something that I will end up. My company had existed at that point for 23 years, and they'd been deployed only in state for flooding and ice storms. That's the only thing they'd done. And my assumption was that that was going to be my role. I was going to help my community in case of emergency. And 9/11 kind of changed that. I got my deployment orders. You can fast forward a couple years, nothing too momentous happened in there. I did follow the build-up to the Iraq War. I think at that stage in my life, I wasn't overly engaged over the war in Afghanistan. I didn't think, it seemed like, well, we had to attack somebody, and Afghanistan were the ones we were going to attack, and I wasn't really paying a lot of attention. But I was paying a little more attention when we decided we were going to attack Iraq. And, as my whole experience in the military hadn't really sat quite right with me, the build-up to the war in Iraq didn't sit quite right with me. I knew that the weapons inspectors were saying, no, they've shown us everything we've wanted to see. There are no weapons of mass destruction. I knew that the international community was saying, there's no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. I knew that there were legal questions. I'm not sure I was at the point where I knew that the war in Iraq was illegal, but I knew that there were people who questioned whether it was acceptable under international law for us to be going into Iraq. And I morally got that it was about oil, about the petrodollar cycle, about control of resources, and not about protecting my family. But I got my deployment orders at the end of 2003. And I very quickly got married to my longtime girlfriend, Etta. And because I wanted her to manage my money when I was gone, I wanted her to be the person who got the flag if I was killed. And I wanted her to know that I loved her. And we got married in 8 days, and off I went. And during that period of time when we were training up to go to Iraq, I struggled with resisting. I wondered what my life would be like if, instead of being a reasonably successful veteran and college graduate, I had to live my life as a convicted felon, as a deserter, as a convict, a coward, a traitor, all of those labels that at least the military and probably our society at large, or most of our society, I now know that there's a significant section of our society that would have embraced me, but at that point I felt like I would live my life with those labels in the eyes of most people. And I didn't want to go to jail, and I didn't want to be those things. And so I went. And I knew I was going to fight in a war that I didn't believe in. My year in Iraq was, I sometimes say I lived a lifetime 1 year in Iraq. We had a period of about 2 months where all we had to deal with were rockets and mortars on the base. We were out on the road, but I didn't have any attacks for a couple months at one point. Then there was a week where I had 3 firefights. There were probably 15, 20 times that improvised explosive devices went off on my convoys. Most of the time, I drove the Humvee. We were in a 3-man team leader. I would drive, and Mac would gun. Sometimes I'd be up in the gun turret. It just so happens the week that I had 3 firefights, I was up in the gun turret that week. And I saw children without limbs. I saw naked children outside of bases whose parents had been killed, who were begging for food and water. I saw people dying from lack of medical care. I saw so many civilians, women, children, walking around with that 100-mile stare that you occasionally will see on a veteran now. I saw an entire country living PTSD, living war, and I knew it was wrong, and I participated in it. And I remember while I was there, at one point there was a Pakistani driver who was hit by an IED, and he was trying to make a living family and worked for the Americans because he could make some money, and he lived. But I remember that was a moment that for me, I shut off my thinking about the morality of the war. And I thought to myself, okay, we might not be the good guys, right? But I'm not a bad person. And I don't want to kill anybody. And they're attacking this guy, and he's not a bad person. He's just trying to provide for his family. So obviously they're bad if they're attacking him. So therefore I can shoot back. And I just held that, and I clutched to that through my deployment. And I made it through. We had 23 Purple Hearts. Not a single person in my company died. We were the only company in our entire brigade, which is, I think, 23 companies, that did not lose anyone. We all came home, which was pretty amazing, especially considering that there were several months when our ammo expenditures, meaning the amount of rounds we fired, were more than the rest of our brigade combined. We had a really, really lucky and intense deployment. And I came home, and then I did what veterans do when they come home, which is I had nightmares, I wet the bed, I had trouble grocery shopping, I smoked a whole lot of weed. I tried. I considered killing myself a lot, and I avoided thinking about the morality of what I'd done as much as I possibly could. And I went right back to school because, God damn it, I went through this because I didn't want to be a nothing convict. So I went right back to school, and my first semester back, there was a woman named Lin Chong. Does anybody know the name Lin Chong? You know the name Lin Chong. So Lin Chong, among other things, is currently the board chair of New Hampshire Peace Action Education Fund. So she's my board chair. Lin was my advanced composition professor that first semester back. And she knew my parents because I'd grown up in Plymouth, and at this point, I didn't want to go back. The Guard wouldn't pay for school in Maine anyway, so I transferred to Plymouth State. So she knew my parents because they lived in town, and she knew I'd just gotten back from Iraq. And she said, "How do you feel about what you did?" And I said, "Well, we shouldn't have gone in, but now that we're there, we got to finish it, got to see it through. We got to make sure we see it through to stability." Because that was what I had to believe to remain sane at that moment in my life. And Lynn said, have you considered writing about that, writing that opinion, making that argument? And I said, no, not really. She said, you should think about it. And then our next assignment, she said, I want everyone in class to make a point of opinion, and write a paper defending it. And I wrote the paper. And I said, I pointed out all the reasons why we shouldn't have gone into Iraq and why the war in Iraq destroyed Iraq and traumatized the Iraqi people. And I talked about everything that was wrong. And then I said, but we need to see it through. We need to stay there until there's stability, without doing anything to defend that somehow occupation could lead to stability, without citing a single historical instance of occupation leading to stability. I just said, well, we owe it to them. We got to stay until things are better. And she gave me an A. She didn't question it, which was very, very kind of her. Because even when I handed in the paper, I knew damn well it was baloney, that occupation can't lead to stability. That was a silly argument. And she just gave me the A. And she'd hand out paper from the comic book Addicted to War that talked about how much we spent on the Pentagon, how many people could go to college with that. She would hand out pages that talked about how the military-industrial complex worked. And every time she would apologize to me. And me, as a growing up Unitarian Universalist, like, this is, you hand out this stuff. This is fine. This doesn't affect me. And I had this dissonance. But Lynn kept checking in with me over the next few months as I dealt with the challenges that I knew that my paper had posed. And she didn't lose touch with me. And in the end, when I was finishing my degree and starting my master's, I, by that point, had come around. And I was still in a lot of pain, but I'd come around politically to know that there was no way that occupation was going to fix things in Iraq. And I was dealing with a lot of guilt around what I'd been a part of and what I'd done. But I wanted to do something to make the world better. So at that moment, I'm in New Hampshire in 2007, which was exactly 8 years ago. And I know you guys are you're probably very grateful to be free of the plague of sociopathic, power-hungry monsters who come into New Hampshire every 4 years to try to become the next emperor. But but that's what goes on. And one of those, who I don't think is a sociopathic monster, a man named Dennis Kucinich, who you may know, was running. And every time he opened his mouth, it was like he was speaking straight to my heart. And so I volunteered for Dennis. At some point in there, Lynn gave me a ticket to New Hampshire Peace Action's 25th anniversary dinner. And the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after that, I had finished my master's in business admin. 3 years after that, I was the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. And I've been doing that for 6 years now. I somehow have managed to keep myself paid through this economy, and with the help of my board, managed to keep myself paid and this small nonprofit alive for the last 6 years. And I've had a lot of time during that to read about how we make change and why we need to make change. So that's the first part of my talk, which maybe took longer than I wanted it to, but I think you get the gist of how I ended up here and why it's relevant, or at least relevant to me, maybe.